today is going to be a pretty basic maintenance video. We have an axle to do on the driver's side of this Nissan Rogue. It is a 2009 or 12. It's a 2012. The driver's side is actually the easier side to do. The passenger side on most of these, well, most Nissans really, most front wheel drive based Nissans, the passenger side goes through a bearing because it is the longer axle shaft, so it goes through a support bearing. And the bearing itself, the outer ring of the bearing, and the casing it sits in, the bracket, are made out of two different metals. And so very shortly after leaving the factory, they bind up and never come loose again. So I'll show you how to handle that when we get there. We're not actually doing that axle, but I'm gonna try to give you some pointers in case you do end up having to do that passenger side axle. So let's get started. In the words of everyone's favorite Australian motorists, first, jack up your car. Alright, so once you've removed the wheel, this is what you're left with. Now this washer guy here has a cotter pin in it that you're going to try to bend straight and pull the cotter pin out to then remove the nut that's underneath. At that point, if this moves freely, if you can push that with your hand freely, then you know you're golden. Otherwise, you can put a punch right in there and hit it with a hammer to try to crack it free. Alright, so at some point we are going to pull the caliper off and hang it up here on the strut, but we're going to leave it on for right now because when we remove these pieces and try to break this nut free, I'm going to show you how to do it without an impact, and that's going to use the brakes. First thing first, we're going to undo the cotter pin. Straighten that bad boy up. And pull it out of the hub. Axle, rather. Any decent axle is gonna come with a new cotter pin and potentially axle and nut. Always replace the cotter pin. It may be an unnecessary safety feature, but a safety feature nonetheless. And guys, especially if it's a customer's car, they've paid you to do that job and they've paid you to do it right. So you might as well just replace the cotter pin. Make sure everything you do is safe, because you're putting someone else's life in your hands when you choose to not include safety items. Okay, so cotter pin gone. You should be able to pull that clip off. If not, you want to find out which one of these little tangs is getting stuck on the threads. Just kind of bend it back a little bit. There you go. It's usually these little tangs that are on either side of the hole that the cotter pin goes through. Whenever they hammer that cotter pin through, it usually just bends these little tabs. But just bend it back, you pop it right off. So, the next step is removing this axle nut. Now if you don't have an impact gun, you can still use a socket and a regular breaker bar. You just use the brakes to hold this whole rotor assembly still. So one way to do it, the punch that you would inevitably end up using to try to pop this axle out of the hub, you want to get one that also fits in between the vanes of the rotor. This way, as you're turning this axle nut, it gets stuck up against the caliper, and that holds this all in place so you can crack that free. just like that. There you have it. Now, you want to try to get this axle pushed through the hub and get it free before you go any further. One way to do it, if you get lucky, try to just push on the axle and see if it comes free by itself. Usually it won't. It's worth giving it a shot. What you don't want to end up doing is hammering on the end of the axle. If you've ever looked up any video or talked to anyone about doing this job, they'll tell you that that causes the end of this to mushroom out or get wider on the very end. So when you go to put the new nut on, it won't fit. In this case, the axle is what's going to end up being replaced, so it won't matter as much, so it isn't as necessary to not do that, but it's just good practice. Another option is to take a punch and put it in the indent in the end of the axle, and then hammer on that, so that way you don't end up damaging the threaded area of the axle itself. There you have it. The axle is free. Next, we're going to pull the caliper off. We're not going to remove the caliper from the bracket, we're just going to remove the whole bracket and caliper in one unit and put it up here on the strut. On the back of the bracket there's two 19mm bolts, one up here and one down here at the bottom. To break both of those free, pull those out, and we'll take this whole bracket and hang it up there. If you have a gun, I highly recommend using it for this part. Now, why do you see people hang calipers when they do brake jobs or axle jobs like this? Is because of this brake line. This brake line is mostly rubber with some fabric woven in there. But letting it hang by its own weight is not good for it, especially if it's an aged vehicle. The hose may already be a little bit aged and damaged. You just want to do your best to make sure you're not adding more problems. So, a simple way, just run a bungee through the caliper bracket, just wrap around a coil spring up top. So just like that, you have your hanging caliper, hung up by a bungee, and it's safe. Alright, pull the brake rotor off. Now we're gonna undo these two strut mount bolts and try to pop this hub down so we have enough room to push that axle through the hub, swing it around it, and pull it out. So you'll need to get a 21mm wrench and a 21mm socket. Put the wrench on one side, socket on the other, and you break them free. Again, if you have a gun, I highly recommend using it. At this point, I feel it's important to note a few things. One, when you pull the inside of this axle out of the transmission, you may get transmission fluid dripping out, so make sure you have a drip pan ready. Two, in this car, the bolts holding this hub onto the strut are not used for alignments, so it should not affect your alignment. It is, however, good to get an alignment after each time you service the suspension components. Thirdly, this ABS sensor will be overextended if you do not remove it from the hub. It's very important when you're removing anything that has electrical sensors on it, or in this case brake hoses running to it, to make sure that when you are manipulating that specific part, you're not going to end up damaging something else. So let's do that. In some cars, it's simple enough to just pop the axle out by giving it a good tug. You want to make sure you're not going to pull the axle in half. It's actually easier than it sounds, being that the inside of most axles aren't held in by anything except for the boot. So make sure you have a good handle on the inside, the far inside edge of the axle when you're trying to tug it out of the axle, and don't just rip it out by the very end here. And there you go. That is the problem. Let's go get the new one. So there's the new little safety device I was talking about before, and the new cotter pin. And most axles will come with a new nut. Now, it really is good standard practice when you get a new part to just match it up with the old part. As you can see, these are very similar. These are, of course, the same axle. The difference, though, when you buy Nissan factory parts versus aftermarket parts is things like this. Just a vibration dampener, which doesn't come on the new one. But, you know, like I said, that's what you get when you don't buy factory. If that's the price you're willing to pay, then aftermarket's a good deal. By the way, I got all of my standard replacement parts from rockauto.com. They send you little magnets, which I think is pretty fun. And as you can tell, I definitely use them a lot. I wouldn't tell you to use them if I didn't use them myself, and I use them all the time. I highly recommend using them. I use them for I have used them for years, many years. They're cheap, they're online, their quality is good, and they usually ship parts to my door within the same business week that I order them. So give them a shot. rockauto.com. They are, by the way, not a sponsor yet. I just highly recommend them. Anyway, back to the axle. So as is pretty typical when you have a torn axle boot, you have a lot of very thick grease left over from the axle spinning very fast. It slings that grease everywhere. You definitely want to try to just wipe up the big stuff at the very least, because that stuff is very, very thick and does not like to come off. If you ever at any point find yourself back under this car to do work around where that axle was, you're going to be very sorry if you don't spend the time to clean it up now. So just give it a quick effort. Just basically try. Quick tip before we get to installing. Sometimes this ring can give you a real struggle when you're trying to put it inside the transmission. So one way to navigate that, put a little body grease around this to keep this ring in place, and it makes it a lot easier to slip it in. On top of that, you're also greasing it up, and that always helps. You do, of course, want to make sure that when you do insert the axle into the transmission, you're not going to end up damaging that seal that's there, because that would be obviously pretty bad. There you have it. To make life a little bit easier for yourself the next time around, you want to take a small wire brush and try to clean the inside of where the axle goes in through the hub. It'll just make it easier so you don't have to hammer it out the next time you do it. So spend a little time, just clean out some of that grit, put a little anti-seize among those splines, and it'll just make it a lot easier the next time you have to service this. I'm gonna do a quick time lapse so you don't have to watch me put all of it back together again. So I should of course mention that it's pretty important that you follow the torque spec for an axle nut, because that is what clamps down on the front wheel bearing or the rear wheel bearing if it was a rear axle and gives it the proper amount of preload. Anyway, in this case, this axle nut torque setting is about 170 foot-pounds. In the same way that you rug it free, you can do the similar process to tighten it down as well. Of course, it is flipped on the opposite side, so it doesn't matter top or bottom, it just matters the direction of rotation. There you go. All done. Not true. We're now going to install this piece and the cotter pin to make sure that that axle nut doesn't go anywhere. To make sure you can just drop the cotter pin in, bend it properly, and set it and forget it. And all you gotta do is just bend the cotter pin to make sure that it stays in place. And there you have it. Our axle nut is torqued, our cotter pin is in, the brakes tightened, the strut bolts tightened, the axle is in, it's not leaking. Just put the wheel on, you should be ready to go. You want to make sure when you're done to clean the rotor, because now that I've had my greasy fingerprints all over it, that's obviously going to decrease its ability to work as a brake. Just clean it up, make sure it's prepared to go out on the road. I'm going to show you the other side, show you what I was referring to before about that very difficult bearing, and we should be wrapped up here. Excuse the tight confines. We are now under the vehicle looking at the passenger axle. Far out there is the wheel. You can see the wheel coming into the hub over there. That is the end that would on the driver's side go into the transmission, but because it is off-centered, you have this long shaft coming out of it. Now right here is the bracket coming off of the engine that this axle has a bearing inside of. Now those two things are made out of two different metals, so they do not come apart. Now I happen to have already done this axle for this customer, so this one will, because I have put a lot of anti-seize on it. But if you are doing a job like this and cannot remove that, unbolt this whole axle bracket. There's a couple bolts all around here. They're very difficult to get to behind the axle. But if you turn to where these cutouts are, you'll be able to with a very small wrench. And it takes a lot of extra time, but it's what has to be done. Once you remove this, pull the axle back that way, and you can kind of maneuver it around the subframe and around the other end of the axle. Sometimes on the other side of that, there's an oil cooler straight up. That also has to be removed to fit this axle bracket out that way. Just a heads up, if you do ever end up getting asked to do a passenger side axle on a Rogue or Altima, or really any Nissan, just be aware that that is an existing problem. Sometimes, if you're not able to get it out, cut this bracket, crack it in half with a punch and a chisel, and you can pop the axle right out, and you'll have to buy a new bracket. That is an alternative, of course, a less desirable one. So lastly, if you saw transmission fluid come out of the transmission when you pulled the axle, it's a good idea to check the transmission fluid level again. Take it for a test drive, make sure everything's okay, check the fluid, and ship it. So that's all I got for now. I'm calling it a night, guys. Good luck if you ever try to do this yourself. I believe in you. It took me about an hour and a half with filming. It's not a very difficult job. It's a good one to learn on. You guys have a good night. Good luck.